Raj Patel, what are the prospects for a change in U.S. trade policy with a new administration? I mean, this is an election year. You've had Barack Obama being very critical of free trade and NAFTA in particular on the campaign trail, and then seeming to back off that somewhat. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think the same as applies to India kind of applies to the United States right now. It is an election year. You're absolutely right, Sharif. And the consequences of that are that there's going to be a certain amount of posturing around the sort of crocodile tears that you hear from rich people about the plight of poor people, and particularly in the United States, the understanding that trade has cost jobs for blue-collar workers here, and trade has imperiled the ability of blue-collar workers to unionize even. That is certainly sort of one of the stories that's circulating in the political rhetoric. But I question the depth of the commitment of Barack Obama to addressing the deep problems that are associated with the current international trade regime. I haven't heard him say that he's going to tear up the World Trade Organization charter and try to negotiate something else. And far from it. He's never gone anywhere close to saying that. All he said is that he would like NAFTA to be renegotiated with stronger environmental and labor provisions. And of course, that was the promise that Clinton made to be able to get NAFTA through in the first place. And those environmental and labor provisions have been worse than toilet paper. So I unfortunately I have my expectations set very low for the next administration.
Raj Patel, you spent a little time interning at the World Trade Organization. Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, well, I was curious to see how it all worked, and I volunteered and I was accepted to be an intern in the Economic Research Department. And I was tasked with finding out why it was, or what the link was between trade and the environment. Does more trade harm the environment or not? And I did the research as best as I was able, and I reviewed a great deal of economic literature, the cutting edge of economic literature at the time, which showed that actually, yes, increased trade does damage the environment. And not just because there's more stuff being produced and it's being sent backwards and forwards, but because the way that international trade works is that it offshores as much production as it can to areas with low environmental standards, and therefore the amount of pollution produced per unit of whatever it is greater in the place where it ends up. So the conclusion was fairly straightforwardly that yes, trade does increase environmental damage, and my superiors at the World Trade Organization took my draft report and rewrote it to come up with the opposite conclusion. So I am very skeptical now when the WTO purports to offer unbiased conclusions about what the so-called benefits of its operations to the international economy, because I guess I've seen firsthand how people's perspectives rather depend on a very politicized understanding of how to represent the facts around the global economy.
Raj Patel, your book is Stuffed and Starved, the hidden battle for the world food system. And I'd like to go back to the global food crisis and its connection to free trade policies. What countries have been affected most by the global food crisis?
Well, there's the shorthand for understanding the countries that have been hit hardest is to look both at the level of wages in those countries and to see the extent to which they are reliant on imports to be able to meet their needs. One of the most disturbing examples is Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and which has been forced by successive U.S. governments to embrace the ideals of international trade. Even before the World Trade Organization was founded, Haiti was being forced to adopt its policies. And Haiti actually stands for a number of other countries in the Western Hemisphere, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, that have been forced to liberalize their economies and are now hostage to the international price rises. And in Haiti, the consequences were that the government was not allowed to support its rice producers. It wasn't allowed to invest in agriculture. So in the 1980s, Haiti produced the majority of its own rice, and now in Haiti, almost all the rice comes from the United States. And that's the sort of singular consequence of the intersection between free trade and or so-called free trade and development policy in developing countries.
Finally, Raj Patel, do you hold out any hope for efforts at reforming the WTO from within? And also, you've talked about the inequities in global trade policy and the structure of the WTO. What do you see as any sort of hope for the future, either within the WTO or without?
I don't see a whole lot of hope within the WTO. I mean, bear in mind that the WTO is basically a club of powerful states that make other states do what they're told. In fact, that was one of the remarks of the U.S. Trade Representative Susan Schwab, that India and China were failing to get into the spirit of the talks. And historically, the spirit of the talks has been for India and China and all the other developing countries to shut up and do what the United States and Europe tell them to do. Now, what has changed is just that China and India and a few other developing countries are here to stay, and Europe and the United States need to learn to change their negotiating positions in order to be able to get the agreements they want. But there's no impetus within the WTO to be able to make serious substantive changes. But what I do see as hopeful is the kinds of alternatives that are being proposed by international groups such as Via Campesina, one of the world's largest social movements that has, by some estimates, 150 million people in it. And they've got a vision of exchange of agricultural policy, of empowerment, particularly women's empowerment, that's known as food sovereignty. And this is something that Via Campesina member movements are fighting for wherever they are. In the United States, it's the National Family Farm Coalition. But in India, there are half a dozen movements. In Brazil, it's the Brazilian Landless Rural Workers Movement. All of these movements, but large, mass-based democratic movements, are pushing their governments to adopt the policies that would invest in rural agriculture, that are not tilted towards the big corporations, but are tilted towards sustainability. And as the current food crisis gets worse, I think that there's a stronger and stronger case for the alternative that the global justice movement is offering, and I think that that's very hopeful.